Real talk, I think we need to have a real conversation about the critical film discourse right now, because there is so much disingenuous and cynical takes on movies that it's actually starting to drive me a little crazy. And no movie did that more than the discussion surrounding Saturday Night, which is the latest Jason Reitman film, which follows the 90 minutes before the first episode of SNL goes on air in 1975. And when thinking about this movie and hearing other people share their discourse with this movie and other prominent critics discuss this movie, I kept noticing that there was such a disingenuous conversation surrounding this movie. I kept hearing phrases like lionizing the boomers, that the actors in this movie were almost cosplaying as the versions of these characters / actors, that these actors had iPhone face, whatever that means, that Jason Reitman is a hack completely. And this is actually the one that frustrates me the most, is if we know SNL made it to air, where are the stakes? So I'm going to be talking about all of this today in this review. But the reason I find this discussion around Saturday Night disingenuous is because I personally believe that there were people going into this movie that wanted this movie to be insufferable. And they actually almost got a pleasure / glee from saying that this movie was bad. And I just think that's just irresponsible / poor film criticism. And I did not want to go into this movie with any sort of bias. I didn't want to go in with this deep history of Saturday Night's early days. I didn't read any of the articles surrounding this film. I didn't read any of the books surrounding this early time in SNL. It was all straight from here, my noggin. The oral history that I've heard growing up, which is a time that I'm familiar with, but really my familiarity with SNL during this time period is watching some of those classic sketches growing up, having a father who was a big fan of Chevy Chase, of Dan Aykroyd, of Steve Martin, of these comics who were big names in the early 1970s with SNL forming. That is all to say that I went into this movie wanting to be entertained, and that I wanted to not necessarily understand how this happened, but capture a spirit of a moment, which I think is what Saturday Night does really successfully as a film. This is a movie that I quite enjoyed, and the praise that I really want to just start delivering on this film is the setting of Saturday Night, which is, of course, capturing Studio 8H, the legendary studio within 30 Rock, which is where SNL is filmed. For 90 minutes, you are just in this area, and you're going around the corner, and there is everything, there is everyone, there's chaos all around. At any given corner, you can run into Jim Henson, Al Franken, Chevy Chase, Paul Schaefer, NBC studio executives, Billy Crystal, Dan Aykroyd. That's what makes this film exciting, is I just felt the sensory overload of trying to make it to air in 90 minutes as everything and everyone is there. And just the amount of talent in that building at that one moment, it really does capture the spirit that I talked about. And I think it does so in a really clever way. And it really just makes the energy of this movie chaotic. Combine that with Jon Batiste's score, who it adds this kind of just upbeat energy the entire time of the movie, where you really feel the pulsatingness of this story, and you really feel the stakes of this character played by Gabriel LaBelle in Lorne Michaels as he is trying to make it to air, and essentially, as he almost defines it himself, revolutionize the air wave. And that's what I really bought into this movie, is I really bought into that level of stakes that this movie is presenting, because of course, obviously, I know SNL made it to air. It was just how this comedy institution came to be. Obviously, I know SNL made it. I know it made it onto the TV screen. But what I think this movie does so well is captures the energy and commitment it took to basically revitalizing comedy as we looked at it in the 20th century. That's what I think this movie captures so Well, on the flip side, though, when this movie does take us out of the studio, that is where I notice the film losing momentum. There is significant character moments that happen throughout this movie in the studio. There's a really great one between a head writer and Chevy Chase, which I think really unpacks the Chevy Chase legacy, explaining this energy, explaining this performer and his legacy that we essentially know he has, which can be often very difficult and not favorable of Chevy. And that moment is captured beautifully within the context of the studio when the film just takes a second to sit with this head writer and Chevy Chase. On the opposite side, though, when this movie isn't in the studio, I notice this film to slow down. There is a moment, especially with the John Belushi plot in this movie, where I notice the energy of the film really dipped, because this is the idea of the stakes where we know it made it to air. This whole film is really at some point revolving around, will John Belushi sign his contract and appear on SNL on time? And I think when it's in the context of the studio and you have everything else going on, that works because it's just another fire that Lorne has to put out. But when it is kind of becomes at one point the singular moment of this film, the triumphant moment, if you will, that's where I notice myself being like, okay, why do I necessarily, am I supposed to feel anything? Because I know what's about to happen. I know that this episode airs, and I know that John Belushi is in the first sketch because it's one of the most famous skits of all time. So that's where I notice myself. That's the criticism of, do we need this film? Like, what are the stakes? That's a moment where I notice the stakes kind of feeling dampened for me. Besides that, when you are just in the mess of the studio, I think the stakes are very clear and you get that high octane energy that the film is trying to capture. But like I said, when the film steps out of the studio, there is one moment with Gilda Radner and John Belushi where I think it is supposed to be the quietest moment of this film. And it's supposed to be almost the peace before the storm that's about to hit when the show goes on in about 5 to 10 minutes. I just didn't buy the scene. It just didn't work. It just pulled me completely out of the movie. However, what keeps me locked in on this movie is the ensemble. Everyone is really good in this movie, but I wanted to highlight a few standout performances. Dylan O'Brien as Dan Aykroyd is great. He is so funny in this movie. He really just shows an energy and captures this personality in Dan Aykroyd without doing an impression, making him feel like a real human being, capturing his artistry. Wonderful performance from him. Corey Michael Smith as Chevy Chase is great in this movie. He's actually the most energetic performer out of all these. This is the one that I loved following the most in it. Maybe it's just, again, because I am a Chevy Chase apologist. And so I had a great time with this character, seeing his levels. And he is also just truly the charisma of it. And Corey Michael Smith's charisma is at an all-time high in this movie. Other great performances, though. Lamorne Morris as Garrett Morris in this film, really good. He is dealing with this identity crisis that he's having, being the only black person on SNL at the time. It is another of these, we are in the chaos of trying to get this episode to air, and this is just another person having another issue that he's trying to get through right before airtime, adds to the stakes. Other performances that are good. Kim Matula as Jane Curtin's really good. Nicholas Braun has a dual role in this film as Andy Kaufman, Jim Henson. Some people are going to be annoyed by the Muppets representation of this film, especially with Nicholas Braun. Jim Henson is essentially a punchline in this movie. I think it works because we know what Jim Henson ends up being, and we know that he is essentially correct in all of his impulses. But again, it is to show that even SNL doesn't always get it right. Even they can't fully recognize talent. And that in some ways the Muppets just wasn't the correct fit, but it would show what was to come. These are all moments that work. And I think the idea of having Nicholas Braun play two of these characters in Andy Kaufman and Jim Henson was just to show how diverse comedy was, especially in the 1970s, where you could have an institution that could have an Andy Kaufman, that could have a Jim Henson, that could have a Chevy Chase, that could have a Dan Aykroyd, that would have a Bill Murray, a Steve Martin, a Jane Curtin, et cetera, et cetera. It just shows how much amazing talent was really in this building. And then speaking of talent, we have Matthew Rhys, who plays George Carlin in this movie. Very memorable, very funny role in this movie. All these performances work, and they're coming in and out of this movie, and it just really does keep the energy and enthusiasm of this movie rolling. And they all come to play, and they are all hitting the marks. They are all hitting the rhythm of this film perfectly. And like I said, this Chevy Chase head writer confrontation, it allows moments like this, even a moment with Dan Aykroyd rehearsing a skit, to really show who these artists are, who they view themselves are, and their role within SNL. And what I loved about this is it doesn't just go stereotypical what we know about these actors, if we know anything. And with Chevy Chase, obviously he has a complicated legacy, which I had mentioned. In this movie, we get to see Chevy Chase have that kind of energy that we know would get him in trouble later on, that would make him known as a standoff actor to work with. But we also get to see someone who is so important to the institution that is Saturday Night, what made it successful, and how so much of that is owed to Chevy Chase, even to a very obvious symbolic metaphor that happens at the end of the film, where he is literally laying the groundwork for SNL. All these moments work for me, and some people are going to find it cheesy. I really liked it. And a lot of these interactions are used to define these titans. And without actually ever breaking the fourth wall, it never feels like the film is winking at these actors' legacy. There's never a moment where, for instance, like Al Franken is on the screen and a character turns around and says, Al, too handsome to be a comedian, too ugly to be a politician. It's not that type of movie where the references are there and that's what we're talking about legacy. It is rather just kind of summating the life of an actor through these dialogue-driven moments. I really liked what Jason Reitman did with the script of this movie. And of course, there are criticisms that I have of this film throughout. And I think one of them is, does our knowledge of knowing what happens harm enjoyment, which I already kind of addressed, but I wanted to re-bring this up, which is, of course, this film presents itself as a ragtag team of renegades. They are essentially these nobodies who make it to air, and they're going to give some of the most important comedic performances of the 20th century that redefined comedy in this moment. It is really supposed to be a representation at times of how comedy was versus what comedy is now. At all points, this movie doesn't necessarily hit that mark. And there are certainly scenes, I think there are moments, especially with the Willem Dafoe performance, that really capture that. And then there are other moments with this movie that doesn't really capture this ragtag renegade spirit that this movie is supposed to be hitting. We're told that these are pioneers. We don't really necessarily see it. And maybe it's, again, the difficulty of just knowing their legacy now. Another issue that I think is fundamental in Saturday Night Live is some would argue that this movie is too self-important. And I understand that criticism. There are certainly moments where this movie takes itself very seriously. There's even a part where this film references Prometheus stealing fire from the gods and then being burned for eternity, or being damned to eternity for that act. That is a literal direct metaphor said in this movie for what Lorne Michaels is doing with comedy at this time. And there's so many monologues given in this film about revolutionizing comedy. Some people have compared this to an Aaron Sorkin script with the fast walking and talking. That is definitely true in this movie, and it is a lot of just walking and talking to really explain big ideas within the comedy industry at this time. I understand why people are going to be annoyed by it, and I certainly did find myself really thinking about how self-important this movie is, and where maybe there would have been a benefit to taking the piss out of this movie, essentially, where it's just kind of like realizing like that Saturday Night is comedy. And I understand, again, maybe it's just the aspiration. Jason Reitman, of course, being the son of Ivan Reitman, worships and respects this generation so much. I think giving it a little bit more light would have actually gotten the idea of self-importance and how big this industry of Saturday Night Live is, because we know how big it is. We understand it. This film doesn't need to constantly tell us that it is. And that comes true even in moments with the old guard, which I mentioned. J.K. Simmons plays Milton Berle. He is Mr. Television of the time, big figure in the 1950s. And I think with performances like J.K. Simmons and Willem Dafoe, their roles are designed to be superfluous. They are there to provide stakes of failure in this movie, at battle with the anti-establishment. That is what this film is trying to present. And I've heard some people criticize it, because I've even heard someone like Willem Dafoe's character, who is a talent relationship executive at NBC, he was actually all in support of Saturday Night and to make him the villain. Some people have issues with it. Again, I don't know the history. I'm not really going to read the history after it, so it doesn't affect my viewing. I understand where some people would get annoyed with it. I understand the criticism. However, my anxiety was quelled due to the central performances of this movie. All of these criticisms that I just brought up are dealt with the fact that I think the central three performances in this movie are really good, and that is the performances of Lorne Michaels, Rosie Schuster, and Dick Ebersol, played by Gabriel LaBelle from The Fabelmans. Rosie is played by Rachel Sennott, and Dick Ebersol is played by Cooper Hoffman, who was the son of Philip Seymour Hoffman. They make you believe in the stakes, the tension. They are the animal wranglers of this movie, and they ground this movie. They are the characters essentially stealing fire from the gods. They are the ones fighting censorship. They are the ones reinventing comedy. They are the defining voice of a generation, and they all feel grounded, and they understand the stakes, and these performances are all really good. Wanted to just shout out Gabriel LaBelle, who continues to just be one of the best working actors today. The energy and pace that he keeps this movie at, he is way too young to play Lorne Michaels at this time period. I never thought about that while watching this movie. He is just so captivating on screen. He works with everyone on screen. He has wonderful chemistry, especially with Rachel Sennott in this movie. It just all works to wonderful degrees, and I think he is such a bright, rising star in Hollywood, and I can't wait to see what he continues to do. But Saturday Night Live overall had a really great time with it. I understand that there are certainly criticisms of this movie, but I can highly recommend it. And I think for a 95 minutes of just absolute chaos resulting in something that is obviously what it is now, I think it's a really fun way to tell this story. And I had a great time. I'm going high with this movie. 4 out of 5 stars for Saturday night.